Hi folks, the purpose of this brief video is to review with you the most common types of MLA citations that you're most likely to use in your own research papers, and to also review the basic formatting of the works cited page and to discuss why that is important. One of the things you'll notice about this cartoon here is that this scientist doesn't seem extremely happy about the fact that he has to cite other sources in his papers. In research, probably the most enjoyable aspect is, being excited about the ideas themselves, and I can imagine that a scientist would be. However, probably one of the things that students find least enjoyable are all the rules surrounding MLA citations, but I just want to make it clear to you that it doesn't have to be something that's this frustrating to you as the kind of frustration that this scientist is feeling. You're going to repeat the same types of citations over and over again, so if you know the most common ones and you feel comfortable with those, citing your research paper won't be that difficult. Now, as I mentioned in the other video, however, it's very, very important that you cite as you go. Do your in-text citations as you move forward and add those citations to your works cited page as well. MLA uses something called author page style, and essentially what this means is that the author's last name and the page number from which the quotation or paraphrase is taken must appear in the in-text part of your paper, and it should also appear on your works cited page. And I have an example of that here that you can review later on if you want, but I want to first go into an explanation of what a short and a long quote is. I think before we discuss those other things, we need to discuss what these rules are and what they mean. So in the body of your paper, when you have a short quote, that would mean a quote that is anything less than 4 lines, and a long quote is going to be any quote that it takes up more than 4 lines on the page of your paper. So let's take a look at what a short quote looks like. Scott Card argues that science fiction reveals to us our many possible futures. So you'll notice here we have a direct quote inside of quotation marks. So you have quotation mark, beginning of quote, you got the quote ends, and then you have a quotation mark before the citation. Now remember, I've used the signal phrase here, Scott Card, so all I have to do is provide the page number that this information was taken from, that this quote was taken from. So it's quotation mark where I'm ending the quote, parenthesis, page number where the information was taken from, in parenthesis, and then the punctuation in a short quote always comes at the end of the parenthesis, after the parenthesis. Okay? Now, many of the sources that you find from the library's databases, though, aren't going to have page numbers because they're HTML full-text sources, and that's what this source is here, this next one. Scott Card argues that science fiction reveals to us our many possible futures. If you don't have a page number, the only thing that you can do is provide the author's last name, which is what this writer has done here. Now let's say you're using a qualifier, or you're just sort of summarizing some main ideas. You can also do this because even though you're pulling things together yourself, let's say a sentence like this might do that. It might summarize, many of the sources at once, or the sentence might make connections between many of the sources, and that's sort of what this sentence would do in the paper. The prevailing view among many science fiction writers is that the genre reveals the many possible futures that many await us. So in this instance, what we have is a statement that originally came from Card, but it also, we notice as researchers, as we're writing our paper, is sort of a similar sentiment to what a lot of the other sources that we've read have said. So we could cite it this way, Card 21. Now, of course, if we didn't know a page number, we would just leave that page number off there and just give the author's last name. But notice we used many science fiction writers for the signal phrase rather than a specific name there. Now, anything that we cite in our paper must be cited on our works cited page, so this source and its publication information would be found on our works cited page. things like the author's name, the title of the work in which this appeared, the date of publication. If this came from a journal, it would be a journal title, its volume number, its issue number, and the specific pages that this came from. So basically what we want to give on the Works Cited page is all the information that a reader of our paper would need to locate this source on their own. Okay, before we go on to the direct quote, let's discuss a long quote. You will recall is anything 4 lines or more. Now the formatting is different in a long quote than it is in a short. So you'll recall that in a short quote we have either the quote or the paraphrase, and then that ends, and then we have inside the parentheses the citation information, and then we have the punctuation for the sentence at the end. In a long quote though, it's treated completely differently. Remember, a long quote is anything 4 lines or more. For this one, for instance, I have many intellectuals of the time period have contended that violent responses heighten the movement's drama. Banks explains. So what this does right here is it sort of sets up that long quote, and then I have all of this information that's quoted word for word from Banks. One thing you'll notice right away is that on the left side that the entire quote is indented 10 spaces from the left margin. You'll also notice there are no quotation marks. Quotation marks are not needed for a long quote because of the indentation. When a reader sees the indentation in our papers, then they'll know, hey, this is a long quote, so they don't need the quotation marks. One other difference is this. In a long quote, the period, the punctuation for the sentence, comes before the parenthesis rather than after it, like a short quote. So the differences again are a short quote is anything less than 4 lines, a long quote is anything 4 lines or more on our page. The long quote is indented 10 spaces from the left margin. The short quote's just incorporated into our paragraph of our paper. The punctuation is different. The punctuation for a short quote comes after the parenthesis. In a long quote, it comes before the parenthesis in that particular citation. Okay, so just to review briefly, short quote is anything less than 4 lines. A long quote is anything 4 lines or more. We've looked at short quotes with page numbers. We've looked at short quotes without page numbers, and we've looked at long quotes, anything 4 lines or more, and the formatting for that. So let's take a look now at what's called the indirect quote or the indirect citation. So let me just briefly explain this. Okay, let's say there's a student in my class at Johnson & Wales, and her name is Maria Lopez. Maria Lopez is writing a research paper about Picasso. And so she goes to the library's databases and she locates a source. And this source is written by Marion Hart, H-A-R-T. Now, in this source by Marion Hart actually quotes another individual. This individual's name is Juliana Huffington, and she is an art historian from UCLA. And Maria, the student from Johnson & Wales, really likes this quote that Hart has included by Julia Huffington. So Maria Lopez, the student from Johnson & Wales, decides that she also wants to include this very same quote in her own paper. This is called an indirect quote or an indirect citation, and so you have to treat this very specifically. It's different than just a regular short quote would be. So what you have to do is, first of all, you have to introduce the person specifically that the quote is coming from. So what you have to remember is that Juliana Huffington did not write the source that Maria Lopez found, so we have to let our reader know who she is. So Juliana Huffington, art historian from UCLA, explains, quote, "The blue period work is quite sentimental, but we must keep in mind that Picasso was in his late teens, away from home the first time, and living in very poor conditions." Now another thing you're going to notice about this is, in addition to we have to introduce this person, now the citation at the end is also going to be different. What you see there is, you've got the end of the quote, the beginning of the parenthesis for the citation, but then this QTD period, this essentially means quoted. So quoted in Hart. Now what this means is that this quote from Juliana Huffington came from this source written by Hart. What students want to do quite often is they want to put Huffington's name in the citation, but that would be incorrect because Huffington didn't write the source. Hart did. Huffington is merely quoted within the source written by Hart. And then Maria Lopez, the student at Johnson & Wales, is taking this quote by Huffington and including it in her paper as well. Now, if you knew a page number in the citation, you might have quoted in Hart space 13, meaning that the information appeared on page 13 of Hart. But if you lack a page number, then you simply just don't include it and you include the author's name instead. Quite often in your research, you're going to come across sources that lack an author. And I think I mentioned in the other video, the reason that this is because many journals and magazines and newspapers actually have staff writers, and these are individuals that haven't yet earned a byline. So you have to treat these a very specific way also. Essentially the citation is going to be very much like the other on the Works Cited page, except it'll just lack the author's name, but the citation will begin with the title of the work. So let's look at how we would introduce it in our paper. We would say something like, in the article Gender, Social Justice and Political Change in Malaysia, published in the Seattle Journal for Social Justice, the author notes, and then we would have our quote inside of quotation marks. Well, for the in-text citation for this, what we're going to have to do is take the title and abbreviate it somehow. We can abbreviate it any way that we want. We just want to abbreviate it in a way that when our reader goes to our Works Cited page, that they can locate that source and that they can identify it based on the title. So for instance, you wouldn't want to choose political change as for the citation here if you had another source without an author that also had the words political change in it. So abbreviate it in some way that your reader is going to be able to identify it on the Works Cited page, and just put that abbreviation inside of quotation marks. So again, this is a source without an author. You also, many of you may have two sources with the same last name. When this happens, all you do is essentially just use the first initial. So we have two people with the last name Miller here, but their first initials are different. Now, if any of you come across people with the same initial and the same last name, then let me know, but most likely you probably won't. And of course, if we had a page number for either of these, we would also include the page number. We could have like A Miller space 12 for to indicate that the information came from page 12 of A Miller. Many of you may also have multiple authors, and in this case, for instance, you'll see here what we have to do is introduce them. Slater, Yang, and Watson argue that tougher gun control is not needed in the United States, and then page 76. If we don't know page numbers, then we're going to have to do sort of what's done in the second example there and do Slater, Yang, and Moore. In the next example, what we have is multiple authors, so a source that's written by multiple authors, and you'll often encounter this. This is going to be similar to the others. You're going to introduce it like Jones et al. In other words, you don't need to state every single person's name. You will the first time you introduce it, but the second time you just refer to them as Jones et al. And then in the citation, you would also include Jones et al. In the page number if you have it, instead of writing out every single name in the citation. I'll let you briefly take a look at the multiple works by the same author on your own so I can get to the Works Cited page here. Just remember that everything that's cited within the body of your paper must appear on the Works Cited page, like all the publication information for each of those. And there are some very specific things you want to remember. Every source must be listed in alphabetical order by author last name. It also must include the works without an author, and those are alphabetized by the beginnings of titles. The other thing you will notice is the indentation. First line of each source begins at the left margin, then it's indented